morning again, everybody. It's Tuesday, 16 February, and this week we're continuing with looking at one anothering, the way we need to be relating to one another, at least in Christian fellowship. This morning I want us to consider Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 21, where we read, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Submit to one another. Now, submission is something that has become quite contentious in recent years, and mainly because it is because of verse 22, actually, not verse 21, which again in our English translations is often translated as, "Wives, submit to your husbands." Wives, submit to your husbands. And many husbands have abused that verse in order to demand that their wives submit to them. And that whole understanding is totally perverted. And a lot of the fault must lie at the foot of our modern translators. And I don't understand why so many of our English translations have introduced a subheading between verses 21 and 22. Up until verse 20, the apostle has been talking about fellowship in the church. Do not get drunk with wine, build up one another with psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. And then he gets to verse 21 and he says, "Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ." Now at this point, our English translators have often put in a subheading along the lines of husbands and wives at that point. And then verse 22 is translated as "Submit to one another out of, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." And it seems to me that that subheading has divided the concept of submission and applied it harshly to the way wives need to relate to their husbands. Whereas if we and realize, of course, that there were no subheadings in the original text. So what it should read as, in the light of the way you're singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to one another, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, and wives to their husbands. Because there's actually no verb in the original in verse 22. It's an assumption. It's not an instruction that is given to wives. It's an assumption that just as people submit to one another, so wives need to also be submitting to their husbands. And it's a fundamental principle of relationships, good relationships. And it really is a fundamental principle of Christian fellowship. It doesn't mean that we're not able to have opinions or that there shouldn't be leadership. But it does mean that there is no domineering or demanding in relationships. It does mean that there's no insisting on having to have one's own way. It means giving space for the other person to be able to speak and for us to listen to one another. When Paul wrote to the Philippians in chapter 2 and verse 3, he says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit." There's the not domineering part. "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." You see, submission to one another has to do with a heart response of humility that considers others as better than ourselves. And if we would work on applying these principles in our fellowship, there would be much greater harmony and much less strife. It's an attitude of the heart. Submission is an attitude of the heart, an attitude of humility towards one another. And we're needing to guard not just our words, but to guard our hearts. And so this morning, as you take time out, won't you ask the Lord to help you to guard your heart, to be able to have a humble heart, and to be humble in relationships with one another, submitting ourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. We'll chat some more tomorrow.